There are a number of challenges in drawing gardens with a black ink fine liner. One of them is simply to, when we have a mass of detail such as this, is to capture the mass in a way that we convey the sheer overgrown, the sheer overwhelming nature of the leaves and the flowers and the plant matter, the superabundance of what we see, and yet we also draw it in a way that it looks real, that we capture the detail without having to try and draw it all. But I think one of the bigger challenges, and this often goes unnoticed when we draw, is to get the perspective correct. Perspective is not an architectural thing, it's just that it's particularly noticeable with architecture. Perspective is simply the way something looks when we view it from any position, from any angle. Often we end up looking at gardens sort of straight on or straight down, but when we look at them along the ground, then perspective certainly is more obvious, and we certainly have to take it into account if we're trying to capture a sense of realism in our drawing. Can I just say at this point that I'm drawing at this first closest part with a 0.5 millimeter Copic multi-liner pen. If we look at the ground, perhaps it's easier if we look at the pathway and imagine turning our screen or our phone on its side so that this pathway was horizontal, and we can imagine it as the wall of a building moving away from us, a wall that's angled away from us. Well, that means that foreshortening is going to be working on that wall. When we flip it back down so it's the ground, foreshortening is still at work. But what's being foreshortened in this case is not lines indicating various concrete slabs, certainly not windows or columns or architectural ornaments, but it's what's on the ground, on the path, the bits of gravel and grit, but it's also what's in the garden on each side. So what happens as things move back in perspective? They become smaller. And that's what we have to make sure happens, that our marks become smaller, that however we try and capture the effect of what's happening, we also capture the sense of distance and of perspective. So that's why I'm starting with my largest pen here in the foreground, and I'm drawing the most detail the most clearly. So you can see me particularly working hard at some of the shadows. My darkest values need to be down the front. Even though there are some dark areas up the back which will need to be dark, they won't be as dark as these closest areas, because in life, the way distance works and looking through more atmosphere, the darknesses that are closer are darker, and the darknesses that are further away, even if they're the same darkness, feel lighter. And we also don't see the detail as clearly, obviously, as it moves further away. And edges and so forth are less substantial. They're sharper when they're closer. And so we use a thicker pen, or I use a thicker pen for the closest parts of this. And then I also draw more detail closer. The other thing we need to do is, as we draw all of this overwhelming detail, we need to remember to have a plan for providing, if you like, breaks for the eye to help divide this into smaller sections to see and understand and to get a sense of distance and so forth. And some of these are going to be by having lighter bands that go not horizontally, but approximately horizontally across our page. Now I've moved to a 0.3 millimeter pen now. Sorry about that jump. I had, I think, 4 minutes where I didn't have the video turned on. You can see that I drew more with the 0.5 millimeter pen on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. And that was deliberate because that side was coming towards us more, and therefore there was more there to see. I also thought it would just help give a little interest visually to the scene if it wasn't exactly the same on both sides of the pathway. Sometimes a bit of asymmetry in some aspect of our drawing technique is helpful for a scene. Now you'll see that with the 0.3mm pen, I've used much the same technique. Oh, can I also say at this point that you're seeing this at 2 1/4 drawing speed. So if you want to see this slower, if you reduce your YouTube video using the cog icon that they provide to half speed, you'll see it at very, very much nearly the actual drawing speed. So if you want a closer look at exactly how I'm creating the effect, how much detail I'm doing, while I'm drawing a fair bit of detail rather, for these tulips particularly that are on the right hand side and their leaves, their sword-like leaves, I'm not overly trying to draw the exact leaves that I'm seeing in the reference. There's one or two that stand out and I think are interesting, and there's a couple of clusters of leaves that I think just have an interesting direction to them and come together in an interesting way. But generally, I'm drawing a few things with some detail, and that also helps me get a sense of exactly how these leaves are growing and therefore how I need to draw them. But then I'm, if you like, doing infill. I'm doing more of the same. And the same on the other side of the road, but in a very different sense, where we have, I think we have French irises on the left-hand side that do have long, bending, but quite thin-looking leaves. Thin because they curve around almost into a cylinder sometimes, and that makes them look thinner. So I've now switched from my 0.3mm pen to a 0.2mm pen. So with this one, I'm doing the final sections of the garden. So you'll notice that I've gone right to the back of this section now, rather than join it with where I finished off with the 0.3. And I did that quite deliberately because I wanted to make sure that I finished this section with the lightness and the smallness that I needed. And the best way to be sure of that was to start how I wanted that to look, and then to work back, slowly getting a bit larger and a little bit darker perhaps in the marks that I put on top of each other. So it was simply a way to make sure I got to the size I wanted up there. It's easy to either start to, when we are reducing size, something such as this with foreshortening, it's easy to reduce the size either too quickly or not quickly enough. And so this is a good way of pacing. I could easily have, when I had the 0.3, done something similar up towards the end of the 0.3 to draw, if you like, the furthest back section of that mid section, making sure I got the size and the detail the way I wanted it. Now, at the very end, this mass of foliage on the right-hand side, you'll actually see me come back over the top of it and put some darker sections in such a way, I think, to both help show what it is, to visually break it up so it wasn't quite such a large mass, but also to help give a sense of distance as things move back. So make sure you don't miss that at the end to see how I actually made adjustments. And this is what we do at the end. At the end, we look back and we say, okay, is this working? Or is there something more I can do that I didn't see or think about at the start where I can tweak this? And particularly with values, I find, because it is hard to work out, is this dark enough before I've got at least something over the entire page. So I've switched now to a 0.1mm pen. There's a bit of back and forth because I tried two pens before I think, no, they're no good. And then I get a brand new 0.1mm pen and think, well, this is better, but I think it's just that I don't normally draw with these, so I'd forgotten how thin and little ink comes out. So I'm now doing this trellis in the back, which is a great thing to have in a scene like this because it provides a bit of contrast to all the foliage. Now, there are flowers in this, a lot of flowers, but it's very hard to represent them using a pen without colour. This is one of the places where drawing in black ink, I have to admit this is not a strong subject for the effects that you can create. And I do off camera have a black and white print of this. It's a very handy thing to do, especially in a scene such as this, where there is a lot of deep colour, to simply take all the colour out and to see how it looks in black and white. Not because we have to now slavishly follow that, because I haven't, but it's a great starting point. And we, of course, can then adjust the contrast. We can make areas light. We can do these things. Just basically play around with every option we have to slide back and forth and see how it affects, and settle on the one that we think looks most interesting for us to try and replicate in some way, or at least be influenced by in our drawing. So with this 0.1mm pen, I'm trying really hard to get a very light touch. I don't want anything too heavy up here. Really, the trellis work should be the darkest section in some ways. There are some trees we can start to see further back that are coming over the top of these beds of flowers. Now, this is a part of Monet's garden at Giverny, just on the outskirts of Paris, that we were very fortunate to be able to visit on a glorious summer's day with hot blue skies everywhere. It really was the most amazing time. I have so many photos of this garden to enjoy back in Australia. The other thing I'm doing up the back is, as I'm sort of doing now, is to try and introduce bands of value through my hatching. These ones are darker bands. Up the back, they're lighter bands. And the further back we go, the more the band represents. So a centimetre of banding at the very back could be entire tree canopies, whereas a centimetre of banding down the front could be the height of one tulip leaf. So because, remember, as things go back, they get smaller, they get narrower and shorter. We need to replicate that. And we greatly condense what we're looking at. Now, if you can see the pathway, I've done some shadows and things on that. Very important with the pathway to take advantage of it to give a sense of distance, of foreshortening, because it's such a contrast to the foliage, and in some ways it's going to be easier to read the path. And so what I do is I, with my 0.5, put some very large marks, as in dots or very slight dashes, to represent gravel, basically, close to the front. And then I use the 0.3 to do some more, just a little bit above. And I really don't do much past that, because the way foreshortening works, we really don't see that detail once we go a few meters further up the path. It tends to equalize out in the light to looking more like an even surface, or at least not something, even if we can see some fine detail, it's usually something that's not helpful for us to try and include in our drawing, because it will somehow pull the distance closer in, and we don't want that. So there are a few darker areas up the back here, and the way I try and do it is to make them a bit darker, but do it by light cross-hatching, light lines, more of the lines on top of each other than we have around, and so creating a deeper grey, but still not a very dark one, because we still want to create a sense of sort of visual distinction between the various elements, whether they're trees or whether they're flowers. You'll see that on the right-hand side, I actually made those red tulips darker. If we desaturate, if we take the colour out, they are actually fairly blackish. Red does have a very dark value, usually darker than we would expect. And so I do reduce them more to value rather than just individual flowers. So I'm still using my 0.1 up the back here and just filling in the remainder. If you're finding this interesting, please hit the like button for me. And of course, if you want to draw this yourself and don't want to draw it from the photo on the video, I'll post this reference photo on my channel community page, and you can take a screenshot and print off a hard copy from there if you'd like. So now we're sort of getting more to the stage where just looking and wondering what needs doing. How do I create a little more distinctiveness between the different sections? I've now got my 0.3 millimeter pen, and I'm darkening some areas as I talked about earlier I intended to do. And I'm really guided by how my drawing looks at this stage more than how my reference photo looks. Because soon I will put away my reference photo and it will just be my drawing. And it works on both sides of the pathway. But you'll notice I don't do as much of the darker banding on the left-hand side. Again, it's this sense of creating a bit of an imbalance between things in different parts of our scene. And here we have it. Gardens are a challenging subject to draw, and for that reason we should at least have a go drawing them. If I were drawing this again, and I usually ask this question once I finish a drawing and look at it, what would I do differently? I'd probably try and reduce the amount of line work in the, if you like, upper half of the midsection, even a bit more. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If this has been interesting, please hit the like button for me and help me out as well. But I hope you do have a go drawing this. It's not easy, but this is how we learn, by pushing ourselves. And some of my least successful drawings have actually taught me the most about drawing. But hey, there's no reason why it can't be successful. I hope this video has given you some ideas of the sorts of ways of thinking and techniques that can help us untangle this sort of scene when we draw. But hey, whatever you draw and however it turns out, whatever you learn from it, make sure you also have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.